How did one act of piracy shape the interests of the British Empire? Stephen Johnson will be here to talk about his latest book, Enemy of All Mankind, a true story of piracy, power, and history's first global manhunt. Which Stephen King book should you read first? Our resident expert, Gilbert Cruz, will join us with recommendations. Alexander Alder will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Stephen Johnson joins us now. He is the author of many books, many best-selling books, including Farsighted and How We Got to Now. But he joins us to talk about his latest book. It's called Enemy of All Mankind, a true story of piracy, power, and history's first global manhunt. Stephen, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
There are lots of exciting terms just in your title and subtitle alone. I want to start with those, even though, and we'll talk about this, there's a larger story that you want to tell with this book. But let's begin with piracy, because that's a fun word. What happened on September 11th, 1695?
There's a kind of interesting, bleak poetry to the fact that this happens on September 11th. Basically, the events that are at the center of the book is a clash at sea in the Indian Ocean between a pirate ship led by a very mysterious figure who would become the most notorious criminal in the world, a guy named Henry Avery, and a much larger Indian treasure ship whose name was anglicized as the Gunsway. And the translation of that into English is excessive treasure or exceeding treasure. So they were being pretty conspicuous with naming this vessel in terms of the amount of treasure on board. And effectively, these two ships confront each other on September 11th, 1695. By all rights, the pirate ship should have been easily overpowered, but two incredibly unlikely things happen. A cannon on board the Indian ship explodes because of some kind of malfunctioning design, which basically turns a cannon into a bomb when it explodes. And so instantly there's this, many people on deck, the Indian ship are killed, the deck catches on fire. And at the same time, the first cannon fire from the pirate ship manages to have this incredibly lucky shot where they split the main mast of the Indian ship in two, which effectively disables it in the water. And so the pirates are able to board the ship. They pull off this heist that in today's currency would be worth as much as $100 million. So it makes it one of the most lucrative crimes in the history of crime. And it triggers a global crisis that reverberates around the world.
Okay, before we get to that crisis, because you would wonder why one act of piracy would do that, just give a general picture of the piracy problem at that time. I'm always taken aback by the way that pirates are sort of these cute ne'er-do-wells in children's picture books or like Johnny Depp for many people. But that's not what piracy was back then. What did it look like? And was this unusual?
Well, actually, one of the origin points to this project for me was years and years ago. I mean, something like 15 years ago when my kids were very young, we went to Disney World and we went on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. And it was right after 9/11. And I had this thought as I was floating down the little canals of that ride and the songs are being sung and everything that
felt very jolly.
That the pirates were the terrorists of the 1700s and 1600s, right? They were these terrifying figures who would show up out of nowhere and burn your village down and attack the women, and people lived in abject fear of them. And here it was 300 years later, and it's just a kind of a children's story. And so that link between pirates and terrorism, which is something that runs kind of subtly through Enemy of All Mankind, actually began on that Disney World ride in some ways. But what's historically really important about pirates at this point in history, and one of the reasons why this particular story has so much significance, I think, is that up until this point, there was a very blurry line in terms of the legitimacy of piracy. So there was this other class of occupation that was called being a privateer. And if you were a privateer, from all outside appearances, you were a pirate. You were attacking other ships and stealing their treasure and doing all these atrocious things at sea. But as long as you weren't attacking, if you were a British privateer, as long as you weren't attacking British ships, you were within the zone of legitimacy. And people like Francis Drake, a couple generations before Henry Avery, went off and basically, lived a life of piracy, but then came back to England and was knighted and bought a giant estate and lived a completely legitimate lifestyle. And so, in a sense, what happens at this period, because of Avery's crime, for reasons we can get into, it's a turning point where the British Crown finally has to take a stand against piracy. They have to basically announce to the world that they're not a nation of pirates the way they've been accused to be.
Let's talk about what made this pirate attack so noteworthy. Obviously, there was the haul, but were there other things that made this a big deal at the time?
There are a couple of big ones. First is the other element of the crime. This ship that they attacked was a treasure ship that had been doing business in ports of call like Mocha in the Red Sea, but it was also filled with religious pilgrims coming back from Mecca. So on a whole other level, it was kind of a Muslim, like religious transport vessel as well. And among those pilgrims were a significant number of women in the royal court of Aurangzeb, who was the great Grand Mughal of India, the last of the Mughals. And this was an unusual thing at the time, right? You would not see a lot of big vessels in 1695 that had a significant number of women on board, but there were all these female pilgrims on board. And so when the pirates attack the Gunsway, they find these women there, and a number of the pirates rape the women on board. Some of the women commit suicide jumping overboard to avoid being attacked. And so there's this kind of outbreak of atrocious sexual violence that happens as part of the crime. And of course, word gets back to Aurangzeb that not only has $100 million of his assets been stolen, but members of his extended royal family have been sexually attacked and violated. And this all is crucial in terms of geopolitics because it's right at a moment in time where there is a major economic transition happening in the world. There's a chapter in the book called Two Kinds of Treasure. And it's basically there are two different ways of making a fortune that are in conflict with each other here. There's a very old way, which is represented by Aurangzeb, which is have an autocratic dynasty, tax your citizens, sit on that wealth and pass it on to your descendants. That's what most of the rich people in the world at this point were people who were, members of some kind of royal family that had some kind of dynastic wealth. But there's this new way of making money that is just appearing, and it comes in the form of this interesting embryonic new organization called the Multinational Publicly Traded Corporation, and that was the East India Company. The East India Company was the first company that actually had publicly traded shares so that outsiders could invest in the company, and those shares could go up or down in value. And for the first time, people were making money, not just through the profits of the business, but through the increase in value of these publicly traded shares. And that turned out to be the future, right? That is how, if you look at the 100 richest people in the world today, the vast majority of them are people who made money because they had publicly traded shares in a company they founded or that their parents founded. So in a sense, there's this clash between these two massive economic forces. And Henry Avery and his little pirate ship gets right in the middle of it, because once Aurangzeb hears that his money has been stolen and his women have been raped, he threatens to eject the East India Company from India, which is the main source of their income. They've been trading calico and chintz and fabrics and so on. And if that had happened, if they'd been thrown out of India, the whole course of the British Empire would have been transformed. It's entirely likely that the British Empire would not have formed in India in the subsequent decades if the East India Company had been ejected.
So why wasn't it ejected?
Aurangzeb puts a number of the employees of the East India Company under house arrest and threatens to execute them. And they begin a furious letter-writing campaign back to London saying, we have to find this pirate, we have to bring him to justice, and we have to announce to the world that we are not going to tolerate piracy anymore, or else this whole incredibly lucrative business that the country is increasingly dependent on is just going to disappear. And so that's what triggers this global manhunt, really the first one in history.
What does a global manhunt look like in 1695, right? Because, I mean, you've written a lot about technology and lines of communication, and even the idea that this becomes a big deal. Like, how does it become a big deal? Where is it reported? How do they get the message out after writing letters to corporate leaders back home in London?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I just find so fascinating about this period. And it really plays across the whole thing, right? So not only do you have these nascent economic systems coming into being, but you have a nascent global information system coming to being, and you have a new forms of media happening in London. The early versions of tabloid media are starting to emerge there, and they're a crucial part of this story because that's where word of Avery's crime first begins to spread. In fact, there are these wonderful traditions of a lot of the early tabloid news sources, what were known as ballad mongers. And there are people in London who would sit on the street corner and they would be selling sheets of paper with the news, but the news was written in verse. And they would sing the news. And you'd hear the song of the news and you'd be like, oh, that's fine. I'll give you a penny for that. I'd like to read more about that story. And mostly what they would sing about was crime. And pirates became a huge part of their kind of material because everyone wanted to hear about these, crimes. So news of Avery's crime first appears in London in the form of a song that people were singing on the streets. The other problem in terms of the manhunt is just the lag of information. It would take 3 weeks to a month for a letter to get from Bombay to London at this point, and then for a letter to come back. So there was a big lag after the crime before the British were able to kind of marshal their forces and send out word to the world that they were looking for this guy, and that played to Avery's advantage. But it's also the first point in history where a global manhunt is even kind of conceivable, at least for the British to execute, right? If they tried to do it 200 years before, they wouldn't have had the kind of early colonial network of outposts around the world that they could send a letter to and alert the authorities about these pirates. But because they had started, they had the colonies in the United States. They had, crucially for the story, they had an outpost in the Bahamas. They were able to send off these kind of world's most wanted man alerts about Avery. It was difficult to pull off a global manhunt back then, but it was really the first time in history where you could even try.
I would think it would also be kind of easy to get away at that point. It's not like there were surveillance systems out there. I mean, let's talk about the object of this manhunt. Who is Henry Avery and where did he go? How easy was it to hide?
Well, that's a great mystery. I mean, one of the things that makes him such an interesting character is that we know almost nothing about him until 1693. We know he was born in Devon, which is where all the pirates came from. Like the Devonshire accent is the pirate accent that all children know. The arg, that's a Devonshire accent.
Wait, why? Why Devonshire?
It was a very nautical part. It's a kind of, southwestern corner of England. There were just a lot of maritime occupations in that world. And somehow a number of them turned to piracy, in part in the later generations, inspired by Henry Avery himself. He inspired kind of the next generation of pirates, which is the really famous generation. So we don't know very much about Avery until 1693. We know an immense amount between 93 and 96, which is basically when Enemy of All Mankind takes place. And then we know almost nothing about what happens after 96. And so he becomes the most notorious criminal in the world for these 3 years, and then he just effectively disappears. I mean, I don't want to totally give away the ending of this book, but he is able to largely, we think, elude the authorities. But they do track down 8 of his crew and stage a big show trial in London. 2 of them kind of turn against their mates, and then 6 of them are tried. And so the last kind of act of the book is this trial scene after the chase. And as a writer, this was an incredibly useful thing because the British government wanted to make this statement to the world about their anti-piracy policy. And so they hired a publisher and transcriber to publish a transcript of every single word in the trial so that they could send it to Aurangzeb and send it around the world so that people would see that they really were anti-piracy. I have a PDF of this transcript that's searchable. And so it enabled me as a writer to quote whole scenes, one from the trial, but also in the depositions that are taken, they discuss in great detail the crime, the mutiny that has happened earlier. And so there are all these opportunities in the book where there's extensive dialogue in these scenes, not one word of which is made up. So to be able to quote directly from conversations that happened in 1694 in a port town in Spain, it was just really unusual, but it's all because this trial happened.
I want to go back to right after that Pirates of the Caribbean ride, and you're getting to these transcripts, because I'm curious, of all the acts of piracy, of all the stories you could tell, why this one? And what was the larger story you wanted to tell? Why did this one work so well for that?
This has happened to me before. This book really began with an idea for the architecture of the book before I actually had the subject matter. I tend to work this way sometimes. So I had this idea for a book that would hinge around one specific event that you would start the book with, and then the book would backtrack and show you all the forces that led to that one specific moment in time.
Did you have a model for that kind of book?
Not really. I mean, I actually weirdly was kind of influenced by Cloud Atlas when I was thinking about it.
The David Mitchell novel?
Yeah, the David Mitchell novel, which doesn't have that structure, but it was thinking about how you could do historical nonfiction, but have a more complicated, almost literary structure like that.
Larry Wright does that in his books sometimes, where he, like in The Looming Tower, he starts at this moment and then he goes back and sort of shows you all the steps that it takes to get there.
And this book goes back in some cases, a couple thousand years. In some of the chapters, it's like, where did pirates come from? Where did the wealth of the Grand Mughals come from? It's trying to understand all the different scales of forces that are coming together to make this happen. So I had that. And the other thing that I had in my head was that it would be interesting to do a story that revolved around a crime. This book is kind of closest to a book I wrote many years ago called The Ghost Map about the cholera outbreak in London in the 1850s, which is now tragically kind of timely again.
Yeah, I was going to go there. Next, well, so you got me there.
Ghost Map is kind of a detective story, right? There's a killer on the streets of London. It just happens to be a bacterium and not Jack the Ripper. And that book also goes off in all these different directions, but it's following this kind of investigation. And so I thought maybe there's a version of Ghost Map that I could do that is rich with historical themes that I'm interested in, but has a crime architecture to it where there's a crime committed and there's a chase and maybe there's a trial and things like that. So I had all that in my head. And then it was just a question of like, what is the crime? And so I just spent a bunch of time researching the history of crimes and hit upon a couple of different ideas and then eventually found my way to Avery. And almost the second I saw it, read about him, I thought, well, this is it. My only concern was that somebody else had done it. It seemed like such an incredibly rich set of threads to pull together.
And nobody else has.
Not kind of in full book length. I mean, it's been written about, but not in a kind of centerpiece of an entire book.
All right, well, let's end on the Ghost Map since you brought that up. As you said, it was about a cholera epidemic. I'm curious if there's anything you learned working on that book that has you thinking today in the middle of the COVID-19 epidemic.
So many things, actually. I think about it a lot. The one thing I guess that is important for us to keep in mind in these, troubled times is that the Ghost Map is ultimately a story about progress and about how a catastrophic outbreak led to a new set of solutions that subsequently prevented outbreaks like that from happening again. Cholera had been devastating London for years, until Jon Snow, the hero of the book, solves the mystery of the fact that cholera was in the water and not in the air. And 12 years after his investigation, London had its last cholera outbreak. I mean, in 12 years, they effectively solved the problem, and it has not come back in epidemic form since then.
12 years sounds like a long time right now.
Yeah, it does. It does. But also, the book ends with this kind of prophecy of a viral outbreak coming to New York and killing thousands of New Yorkers and having New Yorkers flee the city. But it also talks about how 15 years in the future, we will be able to decode the genome of these pathogens much faster. Back in 1854, Snow never even saw the bacterium. He didn't even have microscopes to identify the thing itself. He was just able to detect it through the pattern of deaths that suggested people were getting bad drinking water. We have unbelievable assets now that we didn't have back then. And it's, cold comfort when we're still living in the middle of it. But there's a lot of extraordinary work that is happening right now by people in Snow's tradition who are using data the way that Snow used data to understand the path of the disease and to think about ways to kind of fortify ourselves against it. We don't really have a lot of medicine to help us at this point. Like, data is, in a way, the biggest defense that we have. So in some ways, we're not all that different from Snow and his colleagues in 1854.
And you're a journalist by training. You write a lot about history and about technology. Are you finding this moment intellectually, I don't know, I guess, stimulating? Like, do you find that your cylinders are firing of like all the different ways in which this could play out and angles to look into as a writer?
Yeah. I mean, it's a weird time. I happen to have written Ghost Map, and so there's been a lot of discussion of its significance for this crisis. And The book I'm in the middle of writing now is about basically the history of public health and how we doubled life expectancy since the end of the Spanish flu. And so I just happened to be in the middle of a project that was all about the wake of the 1918 epidemic. And so I have just a ton of work in various stages that are kind of directly connected to what's happening. And so it's been weirdly, although I've been isolated from the world like the rest of us, I think it's been actually the busiest stretch for me in terms of projects I'm working on, the amount I'm trying to write. So it's been fascinating to live through it. Just, I wish it were a little less fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, I say this not to dampen your book sales of this next book, but I hope that it's not quite as timely by the time it comes out.
Exactly. Well, I mean, maybe it'll be timely because the progress in life expectancy that we've made over the last 100 years will have reason to believe that it's going to continue. That's the kind of timeliness I would like to see.
Well, let's wish for that then. The current book, again, is Enemy of All Mankind, a true story of piracy, power, and history's first global manhunt. It's by Steven Johnson, author of many books, including the very timely Ghost Map. Steven, thank you so much for being here.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Gilbert Cruz joins us now. He is the culture editor of the New York Times. He is also our resident Stephen King expert. Longtime listeners of the podcast will remember he has been on here before, also talking about Stephen King alongside Victor Laval.
The Stand remains, it's his sort of American version of Lord of the Rings. It is this giant epic journey tale, this fight between good and evil. When you read it, and when you finish it, you feel as if you have actually accomplished something, as if you've read, one of the important books of the later half of the 20th century.
This time, we're going to talk a little bit about where to begin if you've never read Stephen King before. So, Gilbert, welcome to the podcast.
Pamela, good to talk to you again on this podcast and in life.
I'm going to start actually with your day job. You're the culture editor of the New York Times. I'm curious, and I imagine our listeners are too, what is your job normally like, and what is it like right now, given the state of the culture?
Oh, such a fraught question. So my job normally, I'm in charge of many of the critics at the New York Times, not the book critics, of course, those are yours, but people who cover film and theater and classical music and dance and pop music and TV, just lots of stuff. And most of the performing arts are shut down now. There's no theater, there's no dance, there's no classical music, there's no opera, there's no film and movie theaters. And so it is a very odd time because much of what we cover is just not happening, or rather it's happening in different ways. There's a lot of theater that is occurring through, Zoom calls on the internet, playwrights writing things specifically for the internet. So all of our writers are finding different ways to occupy themselves, but it is an odd time to see everything or almost everything that you cover just sort of go away or mutate into something new. But we're doing a great job, I think, figuring out how to cover it all.
So your pop culture, your high culture, it's performing arts, live arts, visual arts. What is the greatest challenge right now?
I think the greatest challenge is figuring out how to make sure that our amazing writers and reporters are still finding those things out there to cover. And there are lots of these things, right? Because dancers are still finding a way to get their art to people through performances online. Classical musicians are figuring out a way. That the Met Opera did this amazing fundraiser a few weeks ago where singers and musicians all over the world were able to put together these amazing performances, even though they were all in different places. And so it just involves finding things more. Things used to come to us. We knew when the newest opera was going to be at the Met. We knew when certain Broadway shows were opening. Now it's all sort of scattered, and there's much more curation involved because we know that people, our readers at home, are actually faced with the challenge of trying to figure out what to do with all this time, right? They could watch new TV shows. They could watch old TV shows. They could read new books. They could read old books. They could watch, it's almost overwhelming. And so each of those critics specifically, just to talk about them, is finding that they have to curate things more than they have in the past.
I mean, it's interesting because all of these performers who used to have these very specific, as you said, time slots and venues in which to perform can now essentially do what a lot of people have been doing with writing already, which is just sort of set up shop on their own. It's like you have Yo-Yo Ma, who's just putting on these little concerts, or I follow a lot of libraries and museums on Instagram, like the Bodleian and the British Library and the New York Public Library, and they're just putting up their collections, the art museums, showing shows, things from exhibits that normally you would have had to kind of queue up and get tickets for, but now they're all there put online.
It's remarkable. I mean, artists make art, and just because they cannot gather together in person to make art, that doesn't mean they're going to stop. So people are going to do the things that they were meant to do. The difficulty, of course, with all these things is at some point, everyone's going to need to make money again, to pay rent and to buy food. And all of these artists are doing amazing things and finding ways to reach audiences online. The question, of course, is how long can they do that for without necessarily getting paid?
So this is a moment, as you mentioned, to kind of explore some of the classics. And before we get to Classic King, one more personal question for you, because I also follow you on Instagram, and I've seen that you've been watching classic Kurosawa in your spare time. So I just want to ask your recommendations. What have you been watching?
So the Criterion Channel is a wonderful resource for those of you who do not subscribe. The Criterion Collection, of course, is this amazing company that puts out classics of world cinema on DVD and Blu-ray. Now they have a streaming channel. And I heard a podcast a few weeks ago talking about the actor Toshiro Mifune, who starred in many of the great Kurosawa movies. And so I was spurred on to sort of go down the Kurosawa Mifune rabbit hole. I watched Yojimbo and Sanjuro, which are two wonderful Kurosawa samurai movies. There was a part of me that always thought these movies would be work. And 5 minutes into Yojimbo, I said to myself, this is so fun and so entertaining. And I was glad that I did so. Kurosawa and Mifune also did a movie called High and Low, which was based on an Ed McBain novel, I believe. It's sort of a crime movie set in post-war Japan that is tense and fascinating. There's just so much of their stuff on Criterion. There's also a ton of other stuff. I watched a Sidney Lumet directed adaptation of John le Carré's first novel starring James Mason that I had never heard of before, but it was pretty good.
What's that called?
It's called A Deadly Affair. It's based on the first Smiley book, although they didn't have the rights to the name George Smiley, so they just give James Mason another name, but he's essentially playing the same character.
Okay. All right. Speaking of crime and horror and thrillers and many other genres, Stephen King basically covers all of them. And you did readers a very nice service by kind of going through is it 70 novels Stephen King has written?
Yes, 70 novels, short story collections, nonfiction books. He's written a lot outside novels.
And you have read all 70.
I have.
And you have ranked them. And what you've done this week for us is given us a kind of guide based on what people are looking for in a book, to which Stephen King they should choose. So let's start with crime, since you were there. I mean, Stephen King has written crime novels. There are certainly crimes in his books. Where would you go if you wanted to look at that angle? So
one of the amazing things about King is, of course, how many books he's written, and within his oeuvre, sort of the many different kinds of genres that he has dipped into. Someone in a New Yorker article years ago described him as a genre writer more than a horror writer, which I think is correct. He started in horror, but he's done so many other things. So in his later years, he's written detective novels. Some of them have a little tinge of the supernatural. He wrote a trilogy of books starring a detective, the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, And then he wrote a book a few years ago called The Outsider that was turned earlier this year into, I thought, a very good HBO miniseries. The showrunner on that was the novelist Richard Price. The novelist Dennis Lehane, wrote a couple of episodes. It's about a small town. A young boy is murdered. A guy who's a little league coach and a teacher is arrested for the murder. The evidence against him is overwhelming until they find out that he was seemingly in another town far away at the same time. So how can he be in these two places at the same time? It's a great crime novel. There's sort of a spooky undertone to the whole thing. It's a good miniseries. It's a great starting point for someone who wants to dip their toe into King, maybe get a little of the creepiness, but also might be more interested in a mystery.
Okay, I'm going to turn the notch a little bit up in terms of creepiness to suspense. You recommended
Misery. So many people probably know Misery from the late 80s film adaptation starring Kathy Bates and James Caan. Kathy Bates won an Oscar for it. It's a novel about a writer who, after experiencing a car accident, is saved and kept captive by a woman who calls herself his number one fan. And she wants him to write a book just for her. And it is a book that Stephen King initially meant to write under a pseudonym. He had a pseudonym in the early 80s, that he wrote several books under, because it's not pure horror. There are no ghosts, there are no scary clowns, there's none of that. It's just sort of this two-hander, the tension between a man who's trying to escape a woman who is crazy. It gets gory a little bit at the end, but I think if you stick with the book by that point, you can't help but get to the end.
There's a lot of crazy in Stephen King books. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, The Shining, It, I think you would have to argue, contains a very crazy villain. But let's go into what I guess people think of, as you mentioned earlier, what they naturally think of is horror. I mean, what's Stephen King's best horror novel?
I would say, and I didn't put it on this list because it feels like the book you would read once you've sort of the next level Stephen King, once you've sort of dipped your toe in a little bit.
It's like advanced Stephen King.
Advanced Stephen King is definitely it. I mean, it is and I've mentioned it on this podcast before, it's 1,000 pages, or thereabouts, so it's quite long, but it's a book in which he once said he wanted to put everything he knew about horror into it. So it's quite long. It has its problematic aspects, but it is the supreme.
He just spoke about those problematic aspects in an interview with The Times, which I thought was kind of interesting.
He did. David Marchese, the superb interviewer that the New York Times Magazine has, asked him about the end of it. I'm not going to go into it here because it's quite complicated and a little icky, but listeners should definitely check that out. But if you want great horror that is not that overwhelming, intense, and long, the second novel that he published, Salem's Lot, which is a vampire novel, is a great starting point. It has all the King touchstones. The main character is a writer. Salem's Lot is a town in Maine that's full of memorable and idiosyncratic characters. A lot of the book sort of references other horror classics like Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House and Dracula. Of course, it's a great starting point for people who want true horror.
Well, it's hard for me to talk about it with you, Gilbert, without mentioning a certain personal anecdote, which is to say, after you came on the podcast with Victor Laval, I asked both of you, what was the best starter King novel for a teenage reader? And at the time, and I know you won't deny this, although perhaps you will revise it, you recommended It, which I then in turn gave to one of my children who read it very slowly, read it with much hesitation, and afterwards said to me in no uncertain terms, "This book was not appropriate for me, Mommy." Any words in your defense, Gilbert?
Remind me how old your child was.
My child was, I confess, a precocious but 11-year-old child.
Okay.
Teenage, I think for you, probably you were thinking 13, 14.
I was, which maybe is around the time that I read the book. Although I think I read the book in the early 90s, which would have made me around the age of your child.
You are a hardened youth.
The way that I was raised might be a little different than the way your child is raised. Your child has a mother who is able to guide him through wonderful literature. And I just didn't have that. So I picked up stuff that was completely inappropriate for me, full of violence and sex and bad things. And so I probably should have thought a little bit deeper about the context. That said, now your child is a grown-up after reading
That's
that
right.
book. I mean, they're
You've
good.
made him a man, Gilbert.
You're good.
I have to ask, since we're talking about young Gilbert Cruz, what is it that drew you to Stephen King? What made you such a fan? I mean, to read every single book, that is dedication.
So I was one of those kids, and I feel like my son, who's going to be 6, either because of who his father is or because of his own inclination, seems to be the same way, who just wanted creepy stuff. I remember sort of picking up at a young age those scary stories to tell in the dark books that were full, in the mid 80s of absolutely terrifying illustrations, and feeling both terrified by them, but also wanting to see them and read more of those stories. And so there just came a point when, for a kid like that, Stephen King was the thing to pick up. And I stopped reading him probably in my late teenage years. And then I didn't pick him up again until I was in my mid-20s. I was on vacation. I saw a book in a used bookstore. I said, I don't think I've read a Stephen King book in like 10 years. Picked it up. I was hooked. And then I said, well, I might as well read all of these. I don't know. I really don't know what it was, but I just kept going. And then I was done. Luckily, he releases like at least one book every year. So I'm good for the foreseeable future.
Let's talk about a lesser known Stephen King, at least to people who haven't read a lot of his work. He writes a lot of quiet, main stories. I mean, he writes a lot about people. And I wonder if you have a favorite to recommend in that vein.
Quiet stories. I mean,
Stand By Me, in a way, is there is death, obviously, in that book, but it's a death that's already taken place, and it's not a terrible death as far as deaths of children go.
That is true.
Well, which is called The Body, of course, in written form.
King wrote a collection of 4 novellas called Different Seasons, which has The Body, which the movie Stand By Me is based on. It has the story Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, which the Shawshank Redemption movie was based on, and it has 2 other stories. 3 of those have almost nothing to do with the supernatural. King tells us this anecdote, he's told it many times, of running into a woman at a supermarket. She recognized him. She said, I wish you wrote stories that were nicer. I saw this movie, Shawshank Redemption. Why can't you do something like that? He said, I wrote Shawshank Redemption. She said, no, you didn't. I don't know if that story is true, but he has told it many times. But it gets to this perception of he only does one thing when, of course, he does more than that. The story The Body is a beautiful story about adolescence, about coming of age, about what it means to be stuck in a small town. King writes a lot about small town living and to want to get beyond that. It's beautifully written. The writing in some of his bigger books can feel a little blockbustery, particularly in some of his short stories like The Body and other ones. It verges on the lyrical. It's quite nice.
All right. I'm going to bring up very briefly something lightly negative, and then we'll end on the super positive. But not all of his books are wonderful or are his best. They couldn't be. I remember once taking a trip with a friend. We were going to Turkey in the 90s, and we decided, let's get Stephen King's in the airport, and, we'll trade after. And the book that I chose was Rose Madder.
Yeah, that's a book that Stephen King wrote.
All right. Should we move on?
No. I mean, look, when you write as many books as this guy has done, you're bound to have some stinkers. I don't think he would deny that either. I think he has admitted that Rose Madder is not a great book. There's one book called Dreamcatcher that he wrote after the accident in 1999, the car accident that almost killed him. He was walking on the side of the road. He got hit by a pickup truck. He wrote that book while he was on painkillers, which is a terrible thing for a man who's a recovering addict. And I think he would admit that book is quite bad. There are several books he wrote in the mid 80s that he wrote while he was very, very much on cocaine and alcohol. Books like The Tommyknockers that perhaps are 50% too long. So look, when you write so many books, some of them are not going to be very good. Luckily, there are many in his bibliography that are wonderful to read.
Let's end with your favorite Stephen King book of all time.
Oh, that is tough. There are some days when I would say it, as possibly I've said before on this podcast. There are some days when I would say The Shining. There are some days when I would say the first Dark Tower book, which is a slim volume called The Gunslinger. I think for this particular, the book podcast audience, the book review podcast audience, I would say that today, and this is not a false answer, my favorite book of his is On Writing, which is a wonderful half memoir, half guide to how you should write. It's sort of like his version of Strunk and White. He gives instructions for how to be a good writer. It's beautifully written. It's instructive. It's evocative. I love it.
Well, you know what, Gilbert? I agree with you. I also think that's his best book.
We agree.
Our kids might grow up to be very different children, but we agree on
your kids
writing.
Gonna be fine. You're a great mother.
Gilbert, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk to you. This is great.
Gilbert Cruz is the culture editor of the New York Times, and he has written for us an essential guide to Stephen King. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the literary world. Alexandra, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right. You had a really crazy story to tell this week. Please tell it to us.
So I've been following this fascinating copyright case for more than a year. It involves two authors who write in a very peculiar erotica subgenre called the Omegaverse. I'd be surprised if many of our listeners have heard of it, but I'm sure some of them have. I had not heard of it before I started looking into this lawsuit, and I uncovered some very interesting things. But what really grabbed me about this case was that it was a copyright dispute in which the author who accused the other one of plagiarism was actually being sued. So the two authors are Addison Cain and Zoe Ellis. And Addison Cain first published her erotica series in the Omegaverse, which is this genre that grew out of fan fiction. And to give a very crude summary of what it involves, basically, it involves characters who behave according to wolf society rules. So there's an alpha who's dominant, an omega who's submissive, and they sort of engage in wolf-like mating rituals. They are not usually werewolves. This has been a question I've gotten. They're actually humans or other kinds of shapeshifters sometimes. But the wolf kind of behavior is kind of key to the whole genre and what appeals to people about it. So do you have questions about the wolf behavior?
I have many questions. I mean, okay, I want to step back 4 steps just to get a sense of where does this come from? Most people, they've heard of fan fiction. They maybe know about 50 Shades of Grey originally started off as fan fiction based on Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series. Where is fan fiction now? How did we get to the Omegaverse?
That's a great question, and one that took me many, many months to figure out. But fan fiction has been exploding online. It started decades ago, but it really caught on as an internet phenomenon. Essentially, fan fiction is published for free so that you don't violate existing copyright for copyrighted characters from, let's say, novels or TV shows or sometimes real life celebrities. But more and more fan fiction writers have started migrating into commercial publishing by something that's called filing off the serial number. So you simply strip out the character names, change them, and bam, you have a work of original fiction. So that's what 50 Shades of Grey was, and that's what Addison Cain's series was. She originally wrote Batman fan fiction with Alpha and Omega characters and then changed the names and became a very popular author on Amazon. So then we have Zoe Ellis entering the scene, and she has become a fan of Omegaverse stories, which she read through fan fiction, and she came up with her own original one. And, if you came to this genre cold and you looked at their work, you would think, wow, these are bizarrely similar. There's no way that two authors could come up with these romance scenarios where the characters are behaving like wolves and they're doing these very specific things. And, it really looks like a clear-cut case of extensive overlap to the point of, you would think maybe copying. But if you have any familiarity with the Omegaverse, these tropes and these plot points are so common, and they were kind of crowdsourced. So the idea that anyone could claim to have invented them or claim to have any kind of copyright over them, many kind of Omegaverse fans or fan fiction experts see that as a somewhat ludicrous claim. So this has exploded into a lawsuit that's gone on for quite a while. There's a chance that it could go to trial in Virginia in front of a jury, which will be interesting because they'll be forced to consider all these questions. But to me, the two kind of big new things in literary culture that it highlighted were, one, the evolution of fan fiction from being this kind of fringy internet thing to this real commercial force on Amazon. If you go and look at Omegaverse novels on Amazon, there's hundreds of them. Not to mention other fan fiction genres. You might be familiar with the genre of reverse harem high school bully romance, which is very popular on Amazon too.
How do you know me so well, Alexandra?
So suddenly you have something that was sort of a hobby that people were doing for free that has become extremely competitive. And you're having these fights, and often they take place behind the scenes. One author will file a copyright complaint against another with an online vendor like, say, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and those books usually get taken down pretty quickly because the companies, in order to protect themselves from any liability, just take them down. The author who's been accused then has to prove that they are innocent to have them restored. And so that's what Zoe Ellis did. She had her books restored, but she felt that her reputation had been damaged. She'd lost sales. So she took it to court. And so now the question that's come up in this lawsuit, which I think is so interesting, is, can you copyright fan fiction tropes that were collectively created? And I think most legal experts and literary experts think that's probably going to be a no. But it was kind of bound to come up in some case. And it was just fascinating to me that it happened to be this very sort of particular literary subculture that is extremely popular that had escaped my notice for a long time.
I think the fact that wolves are in it, I don't know, maybe it feels apt to me in its way.
Yes, exactly. Wolves are fighting and howling at each other. And the other thing that I think has become extremely common, not just in publishing, but in all creative industries, is kind of the weaponization of copyright infringement when it comes to online vendors. It's this really sort of Wild West atmosphere. And even the U.S. Copyright Office has said this has gotten out of control. There's so much online content. There's a deluge of copyright infringement complaints that often result in content being removed, sometimes for not the right reasons, sometimes for anti-competitive reasons. And on top of that, you have this extremely cutthroat online publishing culture where some authors have tried to trademark common phrases, like a romance author. I don't know if you remember the controversy called Cockygate. What a wonderful name. But a romance author trademarked the word cocky and successfully got other authors who used that word in their title, got their books removed from online vendors. And eventually she tried to sue them. She dropped her suit, but it was a whole scandal. And it's become this tactic that people have tried to use. And so it was interesting to see that kind of conflict play out in this really fascinating literary subculture.
All right, Alexandra, I love that this has become your new area of expertise. I mean, there's no judgment here. Now that you're in the Omegaverse, we'll expect to hear more reporting from that world.
Absolutely. I'm very curious to see what happens when this goes to trial, if it does.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
What are you reading, Greg?
I'm reading a novel called The In-Between World of Vikram Lal, that's Lall, by a Canadian author named M.G. Vasanji. This book won the Gilbert Prize in Canada probably 15 years ago when it came out, and is actually Vasanji's second Gilbert Prize. He was the inaugural winner of the Gilbert Prize when it was established about 25 years ago. He is an Indian-Canadian author, actually born in Nairobi, Kenya, and this novel, The In-Between World of Vikram Lal, is set in Kenya right around the time of the Mau Mau uprising and Kenyan independence. In that country's Indian diaspora community, the narrator, the first-person narrator, Vikram Lal, grows up there in the 1950s, kind of third-generation African. His grandfather came there as part of the British Empire to help build the railway in Kenya and stayed on, settled there, opened a kind of convenience store for the British settlers. And right from the very beginning, it's clear that there's a little epilogue with the narrator looking back in his 50s from exile in Canada that he has become involved in government corruption in Kenya after the uprising, laundering money, and has kind of fled in shame. And so now he's looking back and telling the story of his childhood and the political circumstances that led to the independence there. There are obvious parallels to Indian independence that happened 10 or 15 years before Kenya's independence. And there's something a little preordained about this, partly because it's a historical novel, so you know how the history turned out, and partly because it is a narrator looking back, and so you already know what his present day circumstance is. And with that kind of a book where you know the outcome, it all depends on the execution. And he's done a very smart job in the setup, where in his childhood, he's got a younger sister who falls in love with a native Kenyan, a Kikuyu boy. And he himself falls in love with a British girl. And so you have this kind of tension among all the populations who will figure into the Mau Mau uprising and the independence. And you just kind of watch it unfold that way. It's very enjoyable.
I didn't realize that the Gilbert Prize was only 25 years old.
Yeah, that surprised me too when I read in his biography that he had won the inaugural Gilbert Prize. I thought, that's crazy. That can't be, but it is.
What led you to this book?
I had brought it home from work when it first came out 15 years ago, meaning to read it then because I'm interested in post-colonialism. I'm interested in the story of Kenya's independence. And so I always meant to read it. And then it kind of got buried under other things, and I forgot all about it until Joseph Stiglitz, in his By the Book interview in the book review last month, mentioned this book as one that he had really enjoyed. And I thought, I have that on my shelves, and it sent me back to it. I've been reading it for most of the week now so avidly. I've been going on walks in the morning before I start work every day. And I brought it with me on my walk this morning to continue reading. And I just there's an old graveyard in disrepair in my town overlooking a pond. And I hiked to that graveyard and settled against an old tree stump and kept reading it there.
Greg, it sounds like you're doing quarantine right.
It does.
It was a little bit chilly. And so I had that experience reading where you have this split consciousness where you're like deeply in the world of the book. And then you're like, wait, was that a squirrel? Or, you're not comfortable because you're against a tree and you're a little bit cold. And so your attention is divided between the world of the book and the world that you're sitting in.
I have to say, Greg, during the winter for many years, would go ice skating every day during lunchtime a few blocks away. And every weekend you would come back after having kayaked for miles.
Yeah, it's funny. I have never considered myself an athlete. I certainly am not gifted in that regard. And I wouldn't even say I'm inclined in that regard, except as a sports fan. And yet I find I crave physical activity. I need to kind of be a body in motion.
It's good for you.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just kind of like the American boyhood thing. I was tabulating over the weekend. For somebody who's not an athlete, I have participated in a lot of organized sports in my life, going back to like kindergarten soccer.
You are a real American boy, Greg.
Have you participated in organized sport, John?
When I was young, my dad was a huge sports fan and a big baseball player. He was a very talented college baseball player and had a chance to be more than that, but was much too slow, I think, in the end. But his hand-eye coordination and everything else was really great. So I played baseball as a kid, and I played basketball up through middle school. I think I stopped sort of organized sports halfway through high school. What happened with baseball was in Little League, I was a very good player, but all of a sudden one year, some of the boys had like mustaches and things. And my normally very good pitches were just getting hammered because they were about 3 stages into puberty and I was still scrawny and that wasn't going to work. So no, but I crave physical activity, but I just take long walks. I'm not as ambitious as Greg with the kayaking and the rest.
All right. Neither of you are asking about my physical sportiness. I guess you just know the answer.
You both strike me as sporty types.
I know that you ski, Pamela.
I do. I ski. And, I'm not a joiner by temperament or spirit. And so I was never on a team sport until college when very incongruously and probably for that reason, I joined the rugby team. So
I mean, if you're going to start somewhere.
Well, the reason I started with rugby, because people find that surprising, is that it's the only sport that I'd never failed at before because I hadn't done it. And I was really bad at every other sport and so felt scarred. So I needed to start with something fresh. And the nice thing about rugby is that it's a club sport, so you don't have to try out. But I actually have to say I did pretty well. I was on the A side. I was the prop. I think I've permanently damaged my shoulder labrum from that experience. But I played very gamely for about a year and a half. I loved the drinking after and the singing and all of that. And until I realized, as the stretcher would kind of come and take someone off the field every game, like I could seriously get injured. And it was that realization that I think finally drew my rugby career to a close. So now it's true. I do things like, bike and ski, like basically the kind of loner of sports of the spectrum.
Yeah, although with skiing, you could definitely pull something or fall.
Oh, skiing, I'm convinced I'm going to die. I mean, just the Natasha Richardson thing alone, I see it happening.
Pamela knows I dislocated my shoulder skiing into a tree.
Right.
All in all, reading is a lot safer.
That is true. That is true. John, have you been safely reading?
No major injuries yet. This past week, as Greg knows because he edited my review of it for the paper, I read a short novel by the Japanese writer Yukio Mishima called Life for Sale. Mishima was a really major writer of the 20th century. He wrote a lot of very big books, very important books, and he was a 3-time Nobel Prize nominee. But this is one of his shorter books, I guess what sort of Graham Greene would have called his own entertainments, but I think even less than that in terms of Greene's oeuvre. And I don't know if it's the first one translated into English, but I don't think there have been many, if any. He wrote about 17 of them in 20 years, and they were serialized. They were a little more pulpy and noirish than his major novels. And he would sometimes, according to one biographer, he would sort of squirrel away in a hotel room for 10 days and bang one out. And this
like
one,
Georges Simenon.
Yeah, exactly. And only Mishima, who was a very dark figure in many ways and very famously killed himself in 1970 very publicly at a military headquarters in Japan, where he had given this kind of right-wing rant about returning to old traditional Japanese ways and then killed himself. Maybe only he would start a comedy like this with someone attempting suicide. But the main character, who's a copywriter, 27-year-old copywriter for an advertising agency, just kind of like a mid-level job, and he's successful enough. He tries to kill himself for sort of no reason. He says it's almost like a whim, and he fails. And then he puts an ad in the paper saying that his life is for sale. People can use it however they want, get in touch. And so then these string of people get in touch with him, wanting him to sort of enlist in these dangerous things that will probably kill him. And of course, he kind of comically survives all of them. And because it was serialized, they're very episodic. The first guy who shows up is an old man who says that his very young wife is taken up with a mobster. And to get back at her, he wants the character to seduce her, go to bed with her, and when they're in bed, the mobster's going to show up and probably kill both of them. And they do go to bed, but they don't get killed. So it's a very sort of light, it's almost like if you know Mishima's work, it's interesting. And if you don't, it might be kind of fun because you don't know what he usually writes about. And this, maybe you just want a little comic semi-mystery novel. It's more absurdist than mystery. Nothing really gets solved. And then because I was reading that, I was sort of in the mood to finally pick up a book that I bought at a book fair a couple of years ago, a nice little hardcover copy of a book called Mishima, A Vision of the Void by the great French writer Marguerite Yourcenar. And it's almost like I think she even calls it throughout an essay. It's about 140 pages, not particularly long ones. And it goes through his work, and then it builds to this really, the whole thing is very incisive, but then it builds to this really great final chapter about the thing that everyone wants to wrap their head around with Mishima is like just how did those impulses, those strange and ultimately very drastic and tragic political impulses join with his more artistic temperament. And she's really brilliant on it. And so I had a great time reading that book for about a day in the past week.
John, you said that you were surprised to hear that the Gilbert Prize was only 25 years old. I was surprised reading your review when you mentioned that he had been nominated for the Nobel Prize 3 times. I thought the Nobel Prize doesn't tell you who's nominated, doesn't tell you. They just say, here's the winner, and they don't tell you who else they were considering. But in checking that fact for your review, I find that you were right. they do tell you, but after like 50 years have passed.
Oh, that's interesting. See, I thought they just stopped doing that, but I guess there's a lead time.
That's what it is.
Because I do know that when you go back into history, like mid last century, you sometimes see nominees listed, or at least, people who were nominated X number of times. Pamela, what are you reading this week?
Well, I'm going to talk about two short, fun things that I read. One of them is part of a larger project that's not really my project, but one of my son's, which is he read this book called Real Future, the stories that inspired 16 classic science fiction movies. And I'd only read one of the stories in here relatively recently, and that is the great story Who Goes There, which was the source material for a number of movies, The Thing, in its various incarnations. That story was by John W. Campbell Jr. But I read this week the story The Fly by George Langelaan, and that's because he and I are now watching the movie versions of stories that he's read.
Oh, God.
So we're in the middle of 2001. I basically start falling asleep halfway through anything, so they're broken up into two-part viewings, generally speaking. And we also watched Total Recall and recently The Fly, the David Cronenberg version, which is one of my...
Is that the Jeff Goldblum one?
Yes. Jeff Goldblum, Gina Davis. And it's such a great movie. I loved it when it came out. I saw it multiple times. I hadn't seen it in probably 15 years or so, and it totally holds up. In fact, I actually think it's more brilliant than ever. And I love watching movies where the special effects were old school. It's like Guillermo del Toro, just do it with passion fruit. It's just like you can create that gore and it's so effective. I mean,
see, I have to hop in here real quick, because the reason I said, oh God, when you said you were starting to watch the movies is because the original Fly from way back when, my dad was a big fan and I love that movie. The Jeff Goldblum movie is great. Like, it's really well done. It is so disgusting. I rewatched it a few years ago and I almost couldn't stomach it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's David Cronenberg.
Yeah. No, I love disgusting, but a number of people in our viewing party did not want to watch the fingernail scene, which, is, I know, it's pretty gross. What's fascinating, though, is that the story is so different. I don't know if either of you have read the short story by George Langelaan.
No.
So it's basically after the Fly guy's death. And what's happening is that the widow of the Fly guy freely admits that he is dead and that he died by a steam hammer in a factory. So I hope that I'm not spoiling a plot here for any would-be film watchers. But a key element is that the Fly guy dies in the end, and a woman has something to do with that final death. And that's true in this book. But a lot of this book is about nobody knows what it was that he was working on. Nobody knows why Hélène, who is the widow, has let him die under this steam hammer. And it's a little bit of like a detective story with the commissaire. Everything is in French. This is taking place in France, trying to figure out what exactly it is that happened with the Fly guy. And what's interesting is there's only one scene in which the sight of him is described. And so you talked about how gory and gross the David Cronenberg is. There's a very brief description in here that I have to read because with very few words, the author describes the wife's reaction to seeing her husband very briefly. The horror was too much for me, too unexpected. As a matter of fact, I am sure that even had I known, the horror impact could hardly have been less powerful. Trying to push both hands into my mouth to stifle my screams, and although my fingers were bleeding, I screamed again and again. I could not take my eyes off him. I could not even close them. And yet I knew that if I looked at the horror much longer, I would go on screaming for the rest of my life.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's it.
There's a little bit
That's
more.
how I felt watching the Cronenberg movie.
Now, Pamela, you said there are 16 stories in this book, and each was made into a kind of classic of science fiction movie, and you're watching them all with your son.
I'm not going to watch them all because some of them are not good science fiction movies. We watched Total Recall. We watched The Fly. We started watching The Thing a while ago because after I read the story too, and that one was actually just too gratuitously gross for me. We were watching the John Carpenter version. And now we're watching 2001. And
they didn't put the whole Arthur Clarke novel into this book, did they?
They did.
Oh, wow. So this is a big
thick book, but I'm not reading the whole thing. I just read The Fly. Another book that I read in its entirety but also a very short book in its way, was I won't even say it's a graphic novel. It's a graphic collection by Liana Finck called Excuse Me. And Liana Finck is, I think, just one of the great geniuses who walks the earth. She's written a couple of books. One of them is called Passing for Human, which is a memoir. This is sort of a short collection, really, of her comics off of Instagram. So this marks, I would say, the second graphic novelist that I've really gotten into because of Instagram, for better or for worse. But to me, she's on a level with Roz Chast, which is to say, like, a level that no one else is on. She so brilliantly articulates everything. And I know, John, for sure you would like her. Greg, I don't know.
Is she neurotic like Roz Chast?
She's neurotic like you, John. And I know, I think Greg is too healthful and you know...
I don't know. I've loved everything. I've loved everything I've seen by Liana Finck precisely because of the neurosis.
Okay, well then dive in, I say, because this book is so great. You know, it's a little bit uneven, but when she is brilliant, she's hilarious. And actually, there's a theme here in my reading because I was reading it and chuckling and thinking, you know, a lot of this is just really not for kids, but nonetheless, both of my sons who like Roz Chast enormously have swiped it. So I don't have it in front of me and can't cite anything. And they love her too. I mean, some of her stuff, like, it's for all ages. She has some fun slapstick in there. She's got a section on animals, you know, and it's actually really good for quarantine, I would say, because a lot of the things that exist on Liana Finck's emotional spectrum are things that exist for everyone in quarantine. So I feel like even if you weren't that level of neurotic, like in your regular way of living, that now you are. And we are all Liana Finck now. All right, let's run down the list of books again. Greg, starting with you.
I'm reading The In-Between World of Vikram Lal by M.G. Vasanji.
I read Life for Sale by Yukio Mishima and Mishima, A Vision of the Void by Marguerite Yourcenar.
And I read a short story by George Langelaan called The Fly and Excuse Me by Liana Finck. All right. Thanks so much, guys.
Stay well, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.